So, I have a special guest in which I'm really excited to have on my show today. She is an attorney, a women's rights advocate, and for the past 4 decades, she has helped hundreds of women go from surviving to thriving. And she is also the author of Awaken and Entering the Thriver Zone. Please help me welcome Susan O'Million.
Thank you so much, Tanya. It's lovely to be here.
Yes, thank you, thank you. And I'm just so ready to receive wisdom and knowledge from you today.
I hope so. Was that on the list of things
Yes.
I have? Oh, okay.
You got this. You got this. I already know.
All right.
Yes. So, you're an attorney. As an attorney, I'll say that. As an attorney and a women's rights advocate, you help hundreds of women go from surviving to thriving. But what started that journey for you? What is your story?
Okay, well, I have quite a story, I guess. I've accumulated over the years. Yeah, I am an attorney. I used to practice law in the most conventional way. I used to take women to court, particularly women who were going through divorces and had abuse in their relationships. And that was back in the 1980s when we were just starting to identify some of those ways, and it was hard to get restraining orders. So I would do that, and then I started before I went to law school. Before I went to law school, I started doing work on sexual assault. I wanted to help women who were coming through the system, the court system. So I was doing victim advocacy, mostly in the courtrooms. I always wanted to be an attorney. When I was growing up, there weren't a lot. I didn't know any women attorneys. So to go to law school, where there was only a third of the law students were women, it was a very well, it wasn't unusual at the time, but it was difficult. But I wanted to go there to get a credential to help and work on women's rights. I was very, very enamored of that idea, and had thought that sex discrimination, because I had experienced it myself through the years, that was just wrong, and I wanted to work on it. And as I moved into my legal career doing domestic violence work, I became more and more aware of that issue and how it sort of spun out. I left. That was when I was in Michigan, where I was born, and then I came to Connecticut, where I live now. I started working for a women's public interest law firm because I wanted to focus really on those issues and to do it in such a way that my clients didn't have to pay me. I was working for like a legal aid program, and so we were doing sexual harassment stuff that no one was doing. This is back in the early 90s. No one was doing that work, and really beginning to push out domestic violence, how to get laws passed, how to get better laws passed around sexual assault and domestic violence, and women in the court, in going to court and getting justice, as I'll put that in quotes, in their cases. Then I moved into working for state government here in Connecticut, worked in the Child Welfare Agency, began to see larger public policy issues. And I left that job in 1997, and really I was writing my novel. That's what people do. And what I didn't understand about the work I had done is that somehow I always thought the work would never affect me personally or my family. That somehow I was the other, even though I had met women across all spectrums, race, ethnicity, religion, age. I mean, I had met women rich and poor, who had this problem. So why I thought that? But I think what was interesting to me about that part of my life is that I didn't really know what I was going to do next. And then in October of 1999, my niece, my brother's stepdaughter, was killed on a college campus by her ex-boyfriend. She was 19 years old. She was a sophomore in college. Brilliant, beautiful, very smart young woman. And didn't catch all the warning signs. Not that she didn't understand warning signs, but he had never physically assaulted her until he killed her and killed himself. So I think Maggie wasn't that so much she didn't understand verbal and psychological abuse and manipulation, what we call today coercive control and manipulation. I think she thought she could solve the problem all by herself. And there was really nothing on that campus, a very small liberal arts campus in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that was helping her gave her an idea that there was people who could help her with this. So what was really interesting about that moment when you asked me that question is, how did I get you this work? as horrible as that moment was in Maggie's death, and the terror of that, and how it affected my family and still affects my family, in all of that horror, a part of me is like, oh my gosh, everything I've ever done in my life came to this moment. Because I never could figure out, why was I so interested in these issues? And people would ask me sometimes, like, why, did something happen to you that you haven't told us? I never had a personal experience, but I think I was sort of lining all these things up, or maybe the universe was, to say, okay, this is the work, this is your purpose in life. And the thought that I really had more than anything was, although, okay, so Maggie didn't get until the moment of her death that she was being abused and she wasn't going to get out of this thing alive. So she couldn't move on and she couldn't survive and thrive. So I wanted to help other women who could, because she couldn't. And that's really where my work began, on helping women move on after abuse. And the idea that there is a place to go, because I was on the same journey now as a secondary victim of a crime. How was I going to get from victim to survivor to thriver? I didn't want to get stuck in my anger, and I wanted to do more than survive. But what did that look like? And there was really nobody doing that work. This is now back 20 years. So that journey became more personal and very immediate. I mean, Maggie's dead. This is terrible. We've got to do something about this. And I believe that's really the impetus for me to take on work that I don't know that I'd ever would taken on before. I never imagined myself taking on this kind of more spiritual work, the work of spirit, helping women's spirit to not die or not dissolve, I guess. I don't know how to describe that exactly with human words, but the idea that some part of you is untouched by all this and you can move on and do incredible things, because that was my journey. So if I could figure out my journey, at least from my gut, that I should be able to figure out a way to convince other women to do the same thing.
Wow. So, can you talk a little bit about the book, Awakening and Entering the Thriver Zone?
Mm-hmm. So I've always been a writer. No matter what I do, I end up writing. So I've become a writer. There are two different kind of books. The Awaken is the novel. Remember, I said I was writing a novel way back there before I got to this particular work. And I didn't realize in writing that novel way back then that there were some pieces of it that I wanted to write something after Maggie was killed. I knew it wasn't a memoir. There was just too much stuff going on to do that. And it was too emotional. So Awaken actually turned out to be a story loosely based on my niece's story. I call it inspired by the event. And one of the things that in my own healing process was suggested to me is that it's called, I'm not going to remember the name of it. It's something particularly that's done with survivors of homicide. We all wanted to be in that room in that moment when our loved one was killed, and maybe we could have stopped it, maybe something we could have done, that kind of survivor guilt. And so I decided to write the murder scene. I wrote the scene where this character, loosely based on my niece's story, was in a room, dorm room, and a gun was pulled. And so it was kind of a release of that. I finally knew what happened in that room and that I couldn't have done anything about it. But it was also really kind of terrifying that I had written this scene. And then in the novel, I sort of moved forward from that with these fictional characters into what are all the family and friends around this young woman who's now been killed going to do. And that was, once again, a fictionalized journey. So it was very healing for me. And I also brought a lot in about warning signs, so you could see that in a story. That helps people to see, oh, that character, she missed that warning sign. I'm not going to miss that warning sign. So that was really helpful. The other book is, and I've written a sequel to Awaken called Emerge, and I have another book in that series coming out, and sort of 10 years later, what was happening each in those scenarios. The other book is called Entering the Thriver Zone. It's one of the series of 3 books that I've written. And when I got this thing that I had to go do after Maggie's death, I started doing a workshop. I called it My Avenging Angel Workshop. One of the things, or the quotes that came to me after Maggie was killed, because the young man killed himself, I wasn't going to get revenge in the criminal justice system. How was I going to get revenge? So I got this quote: living well is the best revenge. And I'm like, yeah, that's what I want. That's what I want. That's what I want for my family. That's what I want for other women. So I called it My Avenging Angel Workshops. Remember, I'm not a clinician, I'm an attorney. So I didn't really, I'm doing these workshops, and they seem to click. And I tried to attract women not who were still in the abuse or the sexual assault, or that were sort of coming through multiple traumas like child abuse. And I wasn't going to talk about those stories. I had to make sure they were safe. And we were going to start talking about the next step of their life. And I started to fashion exercises, writing exercises, interactive exercises, arts and crafts activities in these 2-day workshops that I'm still doing today. And women responded. And so I took all that material and put it into the first book called Entering the Thriver Zone. And what that book is really trying to tell women, and it's mostly women, though I have done a little bit of work with men who have been victims or have trauma history, I have devised 7 steps to thriving after abuse. I call it the journey. We're all in a journey, and some people get stuck someplace. Some people keep going between victim and survivor. Let's see if we can push out to thriving. And so that book sort of lays that out in kind of a workbook fashion. And then I followed it up with 2 other books. The third book was interesting. The second book's called Staying in the Thriver Zone: How to Make Your Dreams, Your Desires to move forward in your life. Because, a lot of the women I work with, when they talk about their dreams, they've been sort of stopped by the abuse. So I invite them, okay, so what's your dream? If you had $10 million and all the time in the world, what would you do? And they come up with, well, I want to go back to school. I want to take a vacation. I want to get a better house to live in. I want to make sure my kids can go to college. So starting to lay those out and see where their energy's been cut off. And then the third book is called Living in the Thriver Zone. And I interviewed 7 women from my who come through my program. I not only do a workshop, I do a lot of follow-up programs with them. So some of these women, I've actually been in their lives for 10, 15 years. So I get to see a lot of their progression, and really ask them, how did the material I have help you, and where are you today? How would you describe it? And in these wonderful terms that I could only imagine that I would have that ability to move people. But sometimes it's not that I have to push them that hard. They're like on the precipice. They're on the edge of the cliff. They're ready to go. They know they want something more. They have a longing to have something more happen, and they don't know how to get there. And all I have to do is sort of put my little finger on them, and they're over the cliff without a parachute.
Wow. Wow. I was, you mentioned, you know, helping them to thrive. And one of the things I heard was, going back to school and, just getting a life in a space that they probably never even dreamed that they would be.
Oh, absolutely.
And I work in trauma. And we work with, a lot of families that deal with abuse of some form. And I worked with a mom whose husband was going to take her out and take her life.
Mm-hmm.
When she told me the story, I just had chills, you know, going up my arm. I'll never forget it. And only she can tell that story. I will do it no justice. When her file came on my desk, they said, good luck with that.
Mm. That was
After
a tremendous trauma. That's a very,
exactly, right? So that kind of let me know, wow, heads up. But you still don't want to put that in your head. You understand? You know what you're up against,
right.
But at the same time, you have to give it the benefit of the doubt. And after working with her, and it took about a year, I'm going to be honest, working with her, she called me last year, 2020. I closed out with her in 2019. She called me personally just to say thank you. She closed on a house.
Oh, there's a Thriver success story.
Yes, went back to school for criminal justice. I mean, her life just begins to thrive, as you would say,
Yep.
right? And, I was just really thinking about that when you were telling me about that thriving piece and how they really just they stand in their power,
Yeah.
right? Something they never knew existed,
Right.
and it's really knowing how to tap into that. And it sounds like, that's your passion. That's what you do. I'm going to take you from surviving to thriving,
Yeah.
and yes, and that's amazing. That is
Well,
so
that's a
amazing.
yeah, it's a transformation. One of the things I have, one of the first exercises I do in the workshop is ask them to tell me their favorite fairy tale or children's story, because I think we hold on to stories and they have value for us. Well, my favorite story as a child was always and still is. I'll watch every Cinderella movie ever coming down the pike. I love Cinderella, and I never really understood what was it about Cinderella and was that really grabbed me as a kid and carried through and in doing this work now and examining that a bit. I think it's about transformation. I love those shows on television where they do the before and after,
Yes.
like buy a house and fix it up. I mean, I'm so trans, and sometimes in the workshops I actually get to see the women transform physically in front of my
Mm.
eyes. They'll walk in looking like, I don't know why I'm here, and my therapist told me to come, and I can't, it's hard to get out of bed, and I don't want to tell my story. I don't have them tell stories. I don't tell, as long as they're safe, I don't have them tell their stories. So they don't have to do that. And suddenly something, maybe it's the arts and crafts project we do, and suddenly their face just like completely, and some part of them that has been dormant. And you're right, it may have been dormant since they were children. They may have never felt that, or they can remember as a teenager when they felt kind of the energy, and then all the things kept shutting down and shutting down and shutting down. And nobody told them. I've had women who come into my workshop and tell me, like, no one told me I was even on a journey. I've been a victim.
Yes, yes,
I'm a victim my whole life, and
yes,
nobody told me there was someplace else to go. Yeah, I can
exactly.
look at Oprah's life and see how she got there, but that's
Hmm.
Oprah.
Right.
Um, and so we break it down into pieces, starting with their story, and then I began to get their negative voice to quiet in their head. That negative voice is usually their abuser's voice, or their abuser has added to it,
Mm.
like, you're fat and stupid and ugly and no one ever love you, so you got to stay with me. And that's, I don't know how they do that, how they can like hone right into your own inner critic, and then bringing up the happy person inside. The part of them has been untouched, and they're like, I don't think there's a part of me it's untouched. And then when they get there, it's like, wow, this is really great. So trying to get that energy to start moving, and then use that energy on your goals. I always say to these women, if you're coming right out of an abusive situation or a crisis of a sexual assault, and you go to a job interview, you're not gonna be very impressive. You got to get the energy moving again, and then that's where you're stuck. So you don't have enough, or you haven't got your desire focused enough, or maybe you have some fear that you're not good enough or don't deserve it. The other thing I find really interesting in working on my own journey and also in theirs is that sometimes we forget the reward.
Hmm.
So that if we have a desire, like I had a desire to do these workshops, my inner critic was really loud, like, you don't know how to do workshops. It's certainly not about spiritual stuff, or the spirit of women moving forward. And so I got that to quiet down a little bit. I got a lot of positive energy. And then I sort of pushed through my fear. Oh my God, no one's going to show up, when somebody actually did show up. But I figured out the thing that really, really drives me, that I forgot, or I didn't realize perhaps, is that reward. I have always wanted, I have my highest value in my life, beside integrity, is doing meaningful work,
Hmm.
helping and healing others, which is why when I went to law school, although I wasn't really cognitive of this, I didn't go to law school to become a tax lawyer and make a lot of money. I went to law school to learn about how to help people, particularly women. I took labor law, I took employment discrimination law, and I wasn't going to represent the companies. I was going to represent the victims. So I have always had that in my back pocket, but I don't always use it as I don't put up front. So when I do these workshops, when I write these books, I'm talking to you right now, I'm doing meaningful work, and it feeds me. So then I can come around and say, okay, So that's given me a lot of energy. What's the next thing I'm going to do? Okay, so now I've done this podcast with Tanya. What's the next podcast I can do that I think I can't do? But now I've got this energy because when I do that podcasty thing, I can get my meaningful work in for the day, and then I feel really good about that. So I don't think we give ourselves enough, I guess you would call them spiritual goals. Lots of times we give ourselves monetary goals, like I want to make a lot of money, and and particularly men in our society, they measure success by money. And I'm not saying I don't like money, because I can do something with it to feed my purpose, but it's really about, so I try to tease that out for the women, so let's try to figure out all those spaces, and then and when they figure out where they're stuck, they're like, boom, they're like off doing these things. Like your client, suddenly she's buying a house. I have women who like singing again, and going back to school and becoming CEOs of companies. Not overnight, but they start a
Right, over
steady
time.
process of
Exactly.
seeing each goal takes them to the next place, and the next place, and the next place. And that's really exciting. That's meaningful work for me. It feeds my work, coming back around, but it also allows them to see, like what's next.
Yes, yes. And you're right, it's small goals because, once they see one result really transform or transpire, it's like, oh, wow, I can keep going. Yes, you can,
Right.
Yes, so that's the beauty of it, So do you have a favorite quote or saying?
Well, I do love living well is the best revenge. That's really one of my most favorite because it has driven my work. I also, I'm a great collector of. In fact, I use quotes in my program. I use them, inspirational. I use a lot of them. The women tend to like that because one of the things that I think helps people to overcome that negative voice in your head, which is going to yammer on about all kinds of things, not just who you are, what you're doing, but why did you eat that for breakfast? I'll just go on and on. It's affirmations. So I use a lot of affirmations. In fact, I have a couple up. What I do is, I have, in one of the exercises, I have women do their inner critic exercise, and we do the positive, and then I have them put little sticky notes up. So I have my little sticky notes. I'm a
Oh, okay.
thriver. I have like, I can do it, and they change. They rotate a bit. Sometimes I put them on my bathroom mirror because that's the place you look at most, days. Um, I think it's the aspirational part of it, and how I've begun to realize that so much of this is either ingrained in your head. It's not a part of you. It's what you've been taught, or what you've learned, or what you've seen as examples, what you value. So, when I started doing this work, I felt that my goal for women was to have them live well, and they have started to define that in ways that I couldn't imagine. So, living well is the best revenge, and they like that. They like that idea because they know that the person that's harmed them, you know, they can get back at them. In most cases, there's no justice, even in the court system, and they can forgive them. That's an okay thing to do, but it's not always closure. But it's really about, um, you know, living well. And I'm like, this is a person that's harmed you and thinks that you're not a very good person and has no value for you. And it's going to really make them crazy if you live well,
Yeah.
because that's the last thing they want for you. And they're like, yeah, that's right. And it doesn't even have to be that they're making a lot of money. It's just that they have settled themselves into a place, and that what has happened, what the impact of this other person's behavior on them no longer affects them. It no longer holds them. Um, and I mentioned before that I've done some work with men. One of the things I did after Maggie was killed is I started doing groups with men who were offenders of domestic violence. So I felt that was another thing we had to work on, not just helping the women get out,
Exactly.
but really getting the men to say, why do you do
Yes.
this? Do you understand this
Mhm.
is not really serving you? But I also had done a little bit of work in two men's prisons, one here in Connecticut and one in Massachusetts. Many of the men are actually long term, will never leave that prison for what they've done. And they have killed their wife or partner. Um, but they're interested in being thrivers, because if you talk to these men or anybody who's been involved like this, as you probably know, they have huge trauma histories also. Not that it
Mhm.
justifies their behavior in any
Right.
way,
Right.
but they will tell you about childhood abuse, and
Mhm.
so they want to find that space
Right.
where they can go, and living well
Definitely.
is their best revenge
Mhm.
to whatever happened to
Exactly.
them in the past. So that is my top favorite. Okay, that's it.
Awesome. Awesome. So, what would you say to someone who is either contemplating getting out of a DV relationship or just anyone who's stuck?
Well, they say that it takes 6 or 7 times, 7 or 8 times. It's not a statistical thing. It's more of a sense of the process of getting out. I don't really know how my niece could have got out of this situation. It would have helped if there were more people who were focused on it. But, he was determined to stay in her life or do what he did, which was, if I can't have you, nobody else can. But what I tell women, and I don't do this work anymore, mostly because it's hard for me to do this. Every woman I talk to who's still in abuse is Maggie, and I emotionally have a hard time. But my thing, given what I do today, is that there is a life after this. He had, and I'm using men as the abuser, the perpetrator in most cases, but he has narrowed your view of yourself and has convinced you, and other people perhaps too in your past life, that you are worthless and there's no place for you to go, um, with him or without him, and that a part of you, everything has died and there's nothing left. And I think that there's an incentive to say, there is some place to go, and there are people who are willing to help you, and there is some sense that what is happening to you is not just happening to you. And I have a lot of women who've told me that over the years, particularly getting into a support group. And it's like, I learned this early in the women's movement, the personal is political. There's a larger context for this. And even the words we're trying to use to describe it. That's why it's so important that we've just passed laws in Connecticut and other states about coercive control. We're giving words to it. And the woman would say to me, until I read that book about verbal abuse, I didn't know what he was doing was verbal abuse. So I thought it was my problem. I thought it was something I was doing. So you may not see that in the moment, but there are people who can help you. And it will be scary, even if, particularly if there's physical violence. But I also tell the women, if you can leave a physically violent relationship and get past that physical fear of what could happen and hopefully won't happen, you can do about anything.
Yes.
And you've already been doing almost
Right. Exactly.
everything. Think about what you have to do every day to get through this. And the same thing with going through the crisis of a sexual assault. Hopefully this will be the worst thing that's ever happened to you. And I always measure things in my life that come at me that are difficult by one thing now, which is it more difficult, this situation more difficult for me to imagine moving through than the day I found out my niece was murdered? And the answer is always no. That's harder. That was harder. I did that. I can do this. And I think that freedom to see that and to have role models to see that is really important for a woman trying to get out, because she can begin to identify. He's trying to identify her in this little world that he's created and he's got control of, with through a lot of manipulation and um, and the ability to make her see his part of the world, see the world the way he sees it. I'm in your control. I'm under your control. What I say you're going to do, or else there's consequences, and coming into the larger world. So, but I'm not saying it's easy. And I see the women who have left relationships like that, and sometimes multiple relationships like that, as being so very brave and so very courageous. I also tell them, if you can't do it for yourself because you've been blindsided by his stuff, then do it for your children.
Yeah.
And your children need to see that you can make a change.
Mm-hmm.
And they
Yeah.
already know that
Right.
this is wrong.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Thank you for that. And as we wrap it up, if someone wanted to make any contact with you or reach out to you for more information, how would they be able to go about that?
Mhm. So I have a website, because we all have websites now. It's so
Yes.
exciting. It's called www.thriverzone.com. That's sort of the way I have packaged my business. I think I bring women to the Thriver Zone. I do on that website. You can get information about my books that I just talked about, and purchase the books. If you buy them on my website, I can autograph them for you and say you are a Thriver. And I also have free workshops coming up. They were only in person in Connecticut up until COVID, and COVID gave me the opportunity to make them virtual. So they are free workshops. They're virtual. They're coming up. They're My Avenging Angel workshops. You can go to thriverzone.com, or the other website is myavengingangel.com. They are open to survivors. I've also been doing work, and if anybody out there is interested as a provider in using my materials, I've also been open to doing some train the trainers on those kind of things. I think there's a lot of people like yourself who are in the field working with trauma victims, and the more information and more tools you
Yes.
have
Yes.
are helpful. So I've definitely been doing that. And if people just want to email me at susan@thriverzone.com and have a chit chat for a bit, I'd be more than happy to do that. And there's information there that I hope will save their lives, but also make their lives so much better, because they deserve that, and they can be a thriver.
Yes. Yes. Well, Susan, thank you so much for stopping by and giving us your wisdom
Thank you.
and sharing your story. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your work, and for doing this podcast, which is great, because I think it's another way to get information, and not only information but energy. We're trying to get
Hmm.
the idea that we're moving forward. So
Yes.
thank you so
Yes.
much, and thank you for all of your folks out there listening.
Yes. And thank you. Take care.
Thank you. You too.